All rise. Dalton County Circuit Court is now in session with the Honorable Kwame Rowe presiding.
Thank you. Good morning. You may be seated.
Your Honor, calling People versus Ethan Crumbley, case number 2022-279-506 at C.
Thank you. Good morning, counsel. Appearances for the record.
Good morning, Your Honor. Karen McDonald on behalf of the people of the state of Michigan.
Thank you, Mark Keese on behalf of the people.
Good morning, Your Honor. David Williams on behalf of the people.
Good morning, Your Honor. Paulette Michelle Lofton on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Good morning, Your Honor. Amy Kopp on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Good morning, Your Honor. Deborah H. McKelvey on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. You may all be seated. Today's a time set for our continuation of the Miller hearing in this case. When we were last here, the defense had rested, and the people intended on calling a rebuttal witness. With that, anything we need to discuss before we continue with the Miller hearing?
I don't believe so.
No, Judge, thank you.
Thank you, people. You may call your rebuttal witness.
Thank you. The people call Dr. Lisa Anaker.
Doctor, you're going to approach the witness stand. You're going to stand in the witness box. Face my clerk to be sworn, please.
Please raise your hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you swear or affirm that the statements you're about to make to this court will be the whole truth?
I do.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, if you could, please state your full name for the record and spell your last name.
Yes, my name is Lisa Anaker. My last name is spelled A-N-A-C-K-E-R.
Thank you. People, your witness.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you employed?
I'm a staff psychiatrist and consulting forensic examiner employed at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry.
Thank you, Dr. And could you please briefly describe your educational and professional background?
Yes. I completed 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, followed by 4 years of psychiatry residency training through the University of Michigan's Department of Psychiatry. Following that, I completed an additional year of subspecialty training in the field of forensic psychiatry.
So you're a medical doctor, is that correct?
Yes, I'm a medical doctor.
Thank you. Now, could you please describe some of your postdoctoral training as well?
Yes. After medical school, as I mentioned, I completed 4 years of training in psychiatry residency at the University of Michigan. Psychiatry residency consists of a variety of clinical rotations to gain additional expertise in a variety of areas. These can include things like neurology, inpatient and outpatient psychiatry, addiction medicine, child psychiatry, geriatric psychiatry, psychotherapy, among many others.
Thank you, doctor. Are you a member of any professional organizations?
I am, among others, I'm a member of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, which is the professional organization related to forensic psychiatry.
Are you board certified in forensic psychiatry?
I am.
Can you please tell us what that means and why it's important?
Forensic psychiatry is the subspecialty of psychiatry that's particularly at the intersection of medicine and the law. So forensic psychiatrists are medical doctors, particularly psychiatrists, who've undergone an additional year of training to gain further clinical expertise in areas like civil and criminal competencies, criminal responsibility evaluations, violence risk assessments, and others.
Okay. And do you teach as well?
I do. In addition to my role at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry, I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Michigan's Department of Psychiatry. And in that role, I teach medical students, residents, and fellows in topics related to forensic psychiatry.
Okay. Now, as a medical doctor, do you have a license to prescribe medication through the Drug Enforcement Administration?
I do.
What does that mean?
It means as a medical doctor with that license, I can prescribe medications to patients in clinical settings.
Now, tell us, please, doctor, if you could, what does a staff psychiatrist and consulting forensic examiner at the Forensic Center do?
As a staff psychiatrist, I've treated patients at the center, which is a state hospital in Michigan. Patients who are admitted to the center are typically those who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity or incompetent to stand trial. Many of the patients at the center have serious mental illness, so treatment can involve medications and therapy. As a consulting forensic examiner, I conduct court-ordered forensic evaluations, most likely in competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility.
Okay, and how many of those forensic examinations have you conducted to date?
I've conducted 525 evaluations in the last 5 years.
Thank you, doctor. Could you please tell us the process when you undergo when you complete a forensic examination on a subject?
Yes, when we complete forensic evaluations, it typically starts with a review of the data that's sent to us, which typically involves a court order, which is simply the document that outlines what evaluation the judge wants us to do, and also the review of the police report that accompanies the charges. I then typically consult with the defense attorney to hear their concerns and reasons for the referral, and then I interview the defendant. Following that, I decide whether or not further data is needed. That further data can include things like psych testing by the specific question, or it can involve things like asking for body camera videos, asking for records from hospitals or other medical providers, or asking for records from jails or prisons where the defendant has been located.
So if I'm following you, it's your objective to gather as much information as possible when undergoing this exercise.
Absolutely. The more data, the better in terms of evaluations.
Doctor, have you also studied mental illness and the effects of mental illness more broadly?
I have.
Specifically, have you studied the intersection of mental illness and violence?
Yes, I've co-authored papers on mental illness and gun violence, among other papers.
Have you been qualified as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry in the past?
I have. I've been qualified approximately 50 times in various counties in the state of Michigan.
May I approach the minister?
Yes.
This is people for post 66. Doctor, can you please tell the court what I just handed you?
This is a copy of my CD.
Is that your most up-to-date CV?
Yes.
Okay. Judge, at this point, the people will move to omit 66 as well as move to qualify this witness as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry.
Any objection to either?
No objection.
Thank you. With that, people 66 is admitted into evidence. This witness will be reflected as a witness as an expert in the area of forensic psychiatry.
Thank you, Judge.
You're very welcome. We continue.
Thank you. Doctor, do you always author a report after conducting a forensic examination?
I do.
Okay. And when you write that report, do you document the materials you reviewed in coming to your conclusions?
I do.
Okay. Would that be the best practices in the field?
I would say so, yes.
Why is that?
It's important when the readers of our report, which are typically attorneys and judges, that they know where our opinion came from and what we relied upon to come to our opinion. It's also important when we're testifying to know and be able to reference when we're speaking about our opinion.
Doctor, are you familiar with the defendant in this case?
I am.
Did you evaluate him in your capacity as a consulting forensic examiner for the Forensic Center?
I did.
And when was that?
I evaluated him on March 15th, 2022.
And what was the purpose for that?
I saw him at that time for an evaluation relative to his criminal responsibility.
All right. Did you prepare a report?
I did.
May I approach the witness, Judge?
Yes.
This has been admitted as People 64. Doctor, do you recognize that?
I do.
And what is that?
This is my report regarding his criminal responsibility dated March 29, 2022.
Okay, and you authored that report?
I did.
This is Defense Exhibit N, as in Nancy. This is a report authored by Dr. Colin King from June of 2023. Have you seen that before?
I have, yes.
Doctor, I would like you just to have all three of those exhibits next to you, and if you need to refer to them for any reason, just please let the court know.
Thank you.
Now, the purpose for the evaluation that you conducted and Dr. Colin King conducted were different. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But they did, in fact, address many of the same issues. Would that be right?
That's correct.
Now, in your report, it appears that the sources of information that you relied upon span the first 6 pages of Exhibit 64. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, Doctor, were you able to listen to Dr. King's testimony on August the 1st of this year?
I was.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but according to your report in Dr. King's testimony, it appears that you reviewed all of the information that Dr. King reviewed, aside from some self-reporting that the defendant made to Dr. King. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Now, I want to address a few points from Dr. King's testimony in his report and ask you if you agree or disagree. So, first, Dr. King testified that the defendant is, without question, someone who is mentally ill. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
And that was, in fact, in his report. Is that true?
That's true.
And in Dr. King's report, he was referencing the Michigan statute defining mental illness. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Do you agree that this defendant meets the statutory definition for someone who is mentally ill?
I don't.
Could you please explain that?
Yes. I want to start by saying that the common conception of mental illness, for example, if someone has anxiety or depression, that's different than mental illness that is defined by Michigan statute. My understanding of Michigan's definition of mental illness is that it is a substantial disorder of thought or mood that significantly impairs someone's judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or ability to cope with the ordinary demands of life. So in my earlier example, someone who has anxiety or depression and that sees a therapist might not meet criteria for a statutorily defined mental illness because it doesn't rise to that threshold of a substantial disorder of thought or mood. Now, the statute doesn't specify which disorder automatically meets criteria, but the notion of a substantial disorder of thought or mood is thought to apply most readily to something like psychosis, which is a gross impairment in recognizing reality, or to something like a major mood episode, like a manic episode or a profound mood episode. So in this particular case, I took all of the data that I have available to me, including the defendant's report to me during our multi-hour interview, as well as all the information that I listed, to come to a conclusion that he did not meet criteria for a substantial disorder of thought or mood, specifically at the time of the shooting.
So, doctor, somebody could actually be experiencing internal crisis or symptoms of depression and still not meet the definition of mental illness and certainly not be psychotic. Is that right?
Correct.
Doctor, you were in court when the defense played the videos of the defendant in the Oakland County Jail. That was Defense Exhibit S, as in Susan. First of all, did you know that incident, those videos were depicted from one incident in particular?
I was told that, yes.
Okay, and that was from May the 26th of 2023, which would have been about a year and a half after the defendant had been locked in the Oakland County Jail after the murders. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Dr. King testified that those videos were evidence that the defendant was in throes of psychosis What do you make of those videos?
So those videos were taken from an incident in May of 2023 of this year. So those videos tell us about the defendant's mental state during that one incident in May of this year. It tells us nothing about what the defendant's mental state was like in November of 2021 when the shooting occurred. Now, whether the defendant has developed depression or an adjustment disorder like the jail psychiatrist testified in the year and a half that he's been in jail in a cell by himself, it's possible. But I do think it's important to note that the jail psychiatrist who has been seeing the defendant during her testimony still noted that the defendant was not psychotic and did not treat him for a psychotic disorder even after those videos occurred in May of 2023.
And doctor, you're referring to Dr. Kadar, who testified in, I think, July the 28th of this year. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And of course, you were in court for that testimony,
Correct.
and you reviewed her records as well.
I did.
Now, specifically, Dr. King testified that he diagnosed the defendant with major depressive disorder, severe with psychotic features. Do you agree with that diagnosis?
I don't.
Tell us why.
There are several reasons. I want to start by saying that when we try to diagnose someone in a forensic assessment, or when we're trying to decide whether someone meets criteria for that statutory definition of mental illness, we like to rely on multiple sources of data. Now, there's subjective data, and then there's also objective data. And an example of a subjective piece of data would be the defendant's self-report. It is an important piece of data that we consider, but it is subjective. It's their own experience of what they were going through. Now, an example that might help people understand is if you go to your doctor and you walk in and you say, I have pneumonia, you would expect that that doctor would do more than just take your word for it. You would expect that they would use their clinical judgment and their expertise to determine whether what you're saying actually meets the clinical diagnosis that you think you have. And it's the same way with mental illness. So if someone says they have hallucinations, we need to do more than just take that at face value. We need to use our expertise as well as all the other data that we have in a case to determine whether that's true.
So, doctor, if I could interject, that doesn't mean that he didn't tell his friend or that he didn't tell his parents. It just means as a clinician, you'd want to do further investigation before you give an actual diagnosis.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And so my understanding of Dr. King's diagnoses is that he relied on the defendant's self-report and what he self-reported in text messages, for example, as well as on a variety of psychological tests that he conducted, the majority of which were self-report checklists to come to that conclusion. Now, when I decided whether or not he had a statutorily defined mental illness, I took into account what the defendant told me and those text messages that were referenced, but I also looked at the more objective data that we have in this case, and there's actually quite a lot. So for example, objective data would be something like the videos of the defendant immediately after the shooting, during the shooting, in the police substation. And in those videos, there's no evidence that the defendant was objectively exhibiting signs of psychosis during that time. So what we see in those videos is that the defendant was communicating clearly, he was calm and collected, he was answering questions relevantly, suggesting reality-oriented thought processing. What we don't see is any signs of bizarre behavior, disorganized speech, responding to internal stimuli.
Could I ask you just right there, what is internal stimuli?
When someone's actively hallucinating, the clinical term that we sometimes use is responding to internal stimuli. So imagine that you're hearing a voice or seeing something that other people can't see or hear. That would be distracting. You might be looking around trying to figure out where the voice is coming from. You might be talking under your breath, responding to this voice. You might be looking around, seeing something that other people can't. In none of these videos does the defendant appear to be doing that. Now, that would be incredibly atypical to present with none of those signs that I mentioned if someone was in the midst of an acute psychotic episode.
Okay, can you hear me? Let me make sure you guys can hear me. Yeah, you can. I just have to stop really quick because what she's saying, he literally cleared all of this up prior or at his last hearing, Dr. King did. I can't even explain how great of a job I feel that he did. This is just my personal opinion. Yeah, he did diagnose him. He diagnosed him with, I'd have to go back to the video, but I know for a fact, severe depression, anxiety, neglect. I mean, that's not a diagnosis, but bipolar, psychosis. And what he did is there's this video that was played of him shortly after he was arrested at the police station. And that's what that last video I posted is about. I can play it for you. If we get a break here, I'll play it for you. He just summarized everything perfect. She's saying he didn't experience any psychosis. But like Dr. King said, did you guys not watch the video of him at the police station? Like that picture, the thumbnail, that was him at the police station right after he was arrested. So I don't mean to interrupt, but this is just getting me so mad. Hold on. I'll put it back on.
In addition to the videos, though, there's also other more objective data that I also considered, and that included all of the jail records where the defendant was monitored quite consistently in the hours, days, weeks, months after this offense. And in none of those records does any clinician ever describe him as appearing psychotic, despite some occasional self-reports of hallucinations of hearing his name. And so again, that would be quite atypical for someone who was acutely psychotic to then show no signs of psychosis immediately after the shooting and no signs of psychosis in the days, weeks, and months after the shooting, despite not being treated with an antipsychotic medication.
And doctor, can I stop you again? Now, Dr. King testified that psychosis can wax and wane. I believe that was his phrase, wax and wane. Now, tell us about that, please.
While it is true that symptoms of mental illness can appear more severe at some times and be in remission at other times, it would be incredibly atypical for someone who was acutely psychotic to then show no signs of psychosis, both during the shooting, immediately after the shooting, and then for months after.
Oh, this is what I mainly wanted to add, is that he couldn't have said it better himself, the way Dr. King said it. He said, okay, well, first off, Ethan Crumbley's attorney initially was going to plead insanity plea, but they took that off the table because, like Dr. King said, he said, I do not feel that he was mentally or criminally insane. He says, I feel that he was, what did he say? He was severely mentally ill. And if you have ever like experienced any kind of like, depression, anxiety, just anything, you just could grasp onto everything he was saying so well. He was saying, no, I don't think he was criminally mentally insane. I think he was mentally ill. And I'm unfortunately, however people want to look at it, I believe him and I think it is what it is. It's not an excuse, but I feel that he couldn't have diagnosed him any better.
In jail without treatment. Again, if someone was treated with an antipsychotic, maybe they don't show symptoms. But the defendant has never been treated with an antipsychotic medication, and he's never been diagnosed with psychosis because no jail clinician ever observed him objectively psychotic.
In fact, doctor, did you actually ask him about if he was hearing voices to help in your determination if he was in an acute state of psychosis during the shooting?
I did. So in addition to all that objective data, I asked the defendant if he was hallucinating at the time of the shooting, and he told me he was not. He told me he wasn't hallucinating during the shooting. He told me he wasn't hallucinating in the days prior to the shooting. And I specifically asked him if he was experiencing what's called command hallucinations which are voices commanding you to do something like harm someone else. And he specifically denied those as well. He also didn't attribute any of his behavior to delusions, and he didn't attribute any of his behavior to psychosis, even subjectively.
So, doctor, that covers the psychosis aspect of the diagnosis. What about the major depressive diagnosis? Tell us about that.
Yes. So, while it's clear that the defendant had signs of low mood and anxiety and loneliness going back to even spring of 2021, that's apparent in the text messages. To be diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, it requires a degree of functional impairment that I don't believe the evidence suggests that he had. So, for example, even when you look from the spring of 2021 onward, when you look at what the defendant was actually doing in those months after he started reporting low mood, he was working several days a week. He was hanging out with his friend on a regular basis. He was doing things that brought him pleasure, like hobbies of coin collecting and model rocketry. Even as it gets closer to the shooting, it would not be unexpected that when a person would suddenly lose contact with a cherished friend, that person would be more upset and more sad. That, of course, would be an expected reaction. But even in that month, after he loses contact with his friend, he's still doing things that brought him pleasure. He told me that he brought a bird head into school approximately 10 days before the shooting because that brought him a feeling of pleasure and power. He told me he went to the shooting range with his mom, which he described as fun. When you look at the totality of the data, while I don't contest that he had low mood, I don't think that he met the level of functional impairment that's necessary for a major depressive disorder diagnosis.
And again, doctor, we're not talking about someone who was quote unquote depressed or experiencing crisis. We're talking about the statutory definition to meet major depressive disorder and being psychotic, correct?
Correct. And again, there are different things. It can be difficult to understand. Someone can have anxiety and depression and not meet criteria for a statutorily defined mental illness.
In fact, doctor, in your report, Exhibit 64, you spent considerable time explaining your analysis. That'd be pages 59 to 64. Is that right?
That's right.
Do you have a copy of that report?
It should be in that binder, Judge. If not, I have an extra copy. Exhibit 64, Judge. I have one right here.
Thank you. My binder goes up to 61, but there's nothing behind
May I
it.
approach?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. You may continue.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, in support of his conclusion, Dr. King described some of the defendant's writings as signs of his mental illness and psychosis. He specifically referred to the math assignment from November the 30th, 2021, the morning of the shooting. Can you please tell us your opinion on the writings referred to by Dr. King?
Yes. So instead of an example of a major mood disorder or a cry for help, in my opinion, those writings on the school assignments are best an example of what we call leakage. And leakage in the threat assessment literature is warning behavior that occurs when an individual reveals clues as to their thoughts, their feelings, their fantasies, or their objectives in a way that signals an impending violent act. Now, leakage can be unintentional, but it can also be quite intentional. And the motivations for leakage can include anxiety about the upcoming act, or it can include a desire for notoriety or fame for after the act. And in this particular case, I think that there is data to suggest that the defendant wanted that notoriety. He wanted to be remembered for the shooting, and he wanted to be memorialized for his actions. So in my opinion, those writings on the paper were, again, less an example of a cry for help or a major mood disorder and more an indicative sign of leakage.
Now, doctor, is it significant to you that on November the 30th, 2021, at 9:14 a.m., he was taken from his classroom to a counselor's office and he sat there until 10:52 a.m. when he could have disclosed his plan?
Correct. He had multiple opportunities to receive help and chose not to.
Doctor, is it problematic to form an opinion or diagnosis primarily on a self-report?
It can be, especially when there's other data available, because people can say things for all sorts of reasons. They can be truthful, of course. They could be exaggerating or lying for some sort of secondary gain, or they could simply be misusing a clinical term. So, for example, we may have all heard people say things like, I was really psychotic yesterday, or I was so manic this morning, or she's schizophrenic. Those are clinical terms that are being misused so that someone can describe their experience, but no clinician would hear that and automatically say, yes, that means you're psychotic. So again, we have to take more than a person's self-report, especially in a case where there's such ample collateral data that is more objective.
Now, Doctor, in Dr. King's report, he indicated that he referred to one day of text messages, that's from April the 5th, 2021, between the defendant and the defendant's friend. You reviewed the entire text thread, would that be right?
I did.
Okay. And of course, some of those text messages were quite concerning to you.
Absolutely.
So when you're conducting a forensic examination and you uncover evidence such as this that does cause concern, what do you do with it?
I follow up with the defendant and ask specifically what their thoughts and intentions were when they wrote those things.
Okay. And do you attempt to, like in the case of text messages, for example, find the appropriate context for those?
Yes, the context is always very important.
What did you do in this case regarding the text messages?
So the text messages that you're referencing in the spring of 2021, I believe are the ones where he talks to his friend about hallucinations. And I think it's very important to put those in context. So many of those text messages, when you look just beyond the word hallucination, they're being sent late at night when the defendant is alone in his home and when he's watching horror movies. Now, the defendant told me that he believed that his house was haunted ever since he moved in when he was in the 4th grade. And belief in the supernatural is relatively culturally normative in our society and doesn't mean that someone is psychotic. And it wouldn't be unexpected that someone who believed in the supernatural would have that fear heightened when they're alone in a home late at night and they're hearing noises and they're watching a horror movie. So to me, that doesn't mean that someone is psychotic. It means that they, again, are alone in a home watching horror movies and having that fear heightened. There's other context in Dr. King's report. He lists the text messages where the defendant tells his friend about hallucinating in a Spanish class. And if you keep reading, the defendant tells his friend, a girl in my Spanish class saw the hallucination as well. That's not how hallucinations work. We don't share hallucinations. Two people usually don't see the same hallucination. When you put it in context, you would see it's not clinically lining up with what a true hallucination is. He and his friend also go on to say that they both hallucinate at work. So again, while I don't doubt that the defendant was trying to express things that he was experiencing, that word hallucinations and concluding that he was psychotic based on that, it doesn't fit the context and it doesn't fit the clinical diagnosis of psychosis.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Dr. King also testified that thoughts of suicide are a symptom of psychosis. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't.
And tell me why, please.
It's just not medically correct. Suicidal ideation may seem illogical to many people, but it is different than psychosis. And equating the two and saying that they're the same is not correct.
Okay. Now, I want to go back to something you said earlier about objective evidence and how you rely upon it in forming a conclusion. So you reviewed all of the evidence in this case. Would that be right?
Correct.
Okay. So that includes surveillance video of the shooting from November the 30th, as well as the in-car video when the defendant was arrested.
Correct.
And the video of the defendant being inside the Oakland County Jail after he was arrested.
Correct.
Okay. Those are in evidence and you've seen them.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so we're clear, this is the sort of objective evidence that you were referring to.
Correct. Those would be examples of more objective evidence.
Okay. Now, specific to the in-car video, the shooting video, and the interview room video, tell us what was significant to you when you watched them.
When we're watching a video and trying to determine a defendant's mental state at the time that the video occurred, we're looking for things that are there and things that aren't there. So what's there in the videos is the defendant calm, collected, communicating clearly with police and with his parents. He is answering questions relevantly. He is following commands. What isn't there are any signs of psychosis, any signs of bizarre behavior, any speech disorganization, and again, no responding to internal stimuli. And like I mentioned before, this would be quite atypical for someone who was acutely psychotic to have then turned it off and have no signs or symptoms of it, either in those videos or again, subsequently in jail.
Okay. And doctor, specifically the shooting video of November the 30th, you observed the defendant to aim his firearm at individuals, to pick his targets, choose who to shoot and not to shoot. Would that be right?
Correct.
Now, Dr. King also relied upon the video the defendant filmed of himself the night before the shooting when determining that the defendant was psychotic. We're opining that he was psychotic. Were you able to put that video in appropriate context as well?
Yes. So the video that was referenced was audio of the defendant speaking the night before the shooting. And I believe what was specifically talked about was concerns that he talked about a demon or about demons. Now, I asked the defendant about that very specifically, and he told me that in no way was he trying to say that he was a demon or referencing a demon. It was a reference to the person he described as his idol, which was the Parkland school shooter. And the Parkland school shooter, he told me, referenced demons during his arrest. So when you put that comment in context, there's no signs that that was psychotic. That was a logical reference to the person that he said was his idol.
So he was in effect parroting his idol at that point.
It was a call out to his idol, yes.
And Judge, for the record, those are exhibits 56 and 57 that we refer to.
Thank you.
Okay, Doctor. Dr. King spent some time on his method of diagnosis. He testified there are 4 ways to study the brain and diagnose and treat mental illness. Did you hear that?
I did.
Okay. So he first said that his quote was, mental health people should look directly at the brain through various brain imaging techniques.
Yes.
He then said the second way is to test the brain directly through psychological instruments.
That's what he said, yes.
He testified that the third way is to use symptom clusters.
Yes.
And the fourth way is to guess. Do you recall that?
I recall that, yes.
Okay. So first, doctor, I'd like to ask you, as an expert in forensic psychiatry, qualified 50 times over, do you utilize brain imaging techniques to come to a diagnosis?
Not typically, no.
Tell me why.
There is no brain scan that can definitively diagnose mental illness. If there was, we would use it on everyone who has symptoms, but the research just isn't there yet. In addition, the times that we do use brain imaging would be for a very specific concern that maybe that there was a medical problem underlying the symptoms. For example, someone's very elderly and they're exhibiting symptoms of psychosis for the first time. We might be concerned that they have a brain tumor or something that might mimic psychiatric illness in that age. So those are the situations where we're most likely going to get brain imaging, and otherwise it's just not typically used to diagnose mental illness.
Thank you. What about psychological testing?
Psychological testing definitely has important uses, but they're typically to answer a particular question. For example, if I had concern that someone is malingering or feigning symptoms, I might want to do psychological testing. The important thing about psychological testing, though, is that it's a relatively here and now evaluation. So it's going to tell me the defendant's mental state at the time that the test is given. And for criminal responsibility, which is what I was evaluating the defendant for, that's an evaluation of the defendant's mental state at the time of the shooting. So a test 6 months later, a year later, a year and a half later, is going to be less useful to me than all of the objective data depicting the defendant at the time of the shooting.
Now, you mentioned it. Can you elaborate on the specific test that that Dr. King utilized to evaluate the defendant?
Yes. Dr. King spoke about a variety of tests that he gave the defendant. And with some exception, of course, the majority of those tests were self-report checklists or questionnaires, meaning the defendant, checked boxes or endorsed various symptoms for how he was feeling at the time that the test was given. Now, those can be useful, but it's important to know that most of those tests don't have validity indicators. And what that means is that without validity indicators, we don't know if the defendant was over-reporting symptoms, under-reporting symptoms, or even responding relevantly to the test. So for example, I could give you a self-report questionnaire and you could check every single box and we could say, wow, the results are that you have the worst case of whatever it is, but we wouldn't know without validity indicators if that was a legitimate response. In addition, 2 of the tests that were given were not normed on juveniles less than the age of 18, so the results may not be valid. One of the tests even had very specifically a checklist for children, and the adult version was used. So again, whether those results are valid is in question. But regardless, I think the takeaway is that with some exceptions, the majority were again self-report questionnaires.
Before you move on, you mentioned 2 of the tests. Do you know
Yes.
specifically which 2 tests?
Yes. So the brief psychiatric rating scale is the one that has a child or a juvenile version. And then the evaluation of competency to stand trial revised is typically normed on adults over the age of 18.
Now, doctor, what do you do when you make a diagnosis?
So to make a psychiatric diagnosis in a forensic assessment or elsewhere, we rely on our diagnostic manual and our clinical judgment and the data that we have in every case. So again, the more pieces of data, the better. But it's not typically done through brain imaging, and while psychological testing can be useful, for criminal responsibility evaluations, we're really looking at what the defendant's telling us. Does it match with the records? Does it match with any video or audio that we have? And then using our clinical judgment to see if it matches with our diagnostic manual.
Do you guess?
No, I do not guess, and nor does any forensic evaluator that I know guess when doing forensic evaluations.
Now, doctor, I want to move on to some other testimony from Dr. King. He indicated and he stated that he had concerns that the defendant suffered a brain injury. Did you hear that testimony?
I did, yes.
Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you to crack an egg, but can you please tell us what a traumatic brain injury is?
Yes. A traumatic brain injury, or TBI, as it's often abbreviated, is an injury to the brain that occurs when there's a blow to the head of some kind. And there usually are recognizable signs or symptoms that occur in the hours, days, months after such an injury.
Okay. So is it fair to say that you don't suffer a brain injury every time you hit your head?
No, not every head injury is a TBI. People can obviously hit their head and not have signs or symptoms of a TBI.
Okay. So what are those signs and symptoms?
So signs of a TBI that you might want to look for in the early hours, especially, would be things like headache, nausea, vomiting, vision, hearing changes, dizziness, balance problems, confusion, memory problems. There are many.
So you reviewed that same video clip that the defense played of the defendant in 2020 at a restaurant, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So first of all, how would you actually diagnose somebody with a brain injury or traumatic brain injury?
So if you're diagnosing someone with a TBI, it can involve brain imaging, but also the majority of the way we diagnose it is with clinical symptoms, because many TBIs, or some of them at least, might not have any brain imaging changes. For example, a concussion is a mild TBI, and there are MRIs of people who have a concussion that would show nothing abnormal. So that's why we rely on clinical symptoms primarily when diagnosing TBIs.
Okay. So, and you didn't order or request any brain imaging tests?
No.
And why not?
Because I didn't see any evidence of a TBI.
Okay. In fact, you asked the defendant specifically about that diner incident from 2020. Is that right?
I did.
And what did he say?
He told me that he had forgotten to eat one day and felt lightheaded and had gone to work, and instead of being able to sit down or lie down or eat something, he continued to work. It was a hot kitchen, steam, he was carrying a lot of heavy things, and he felt lightheaded and he fell.
Okay. Now, I do want to clear up one other aspect of Dr. King's testimony. He testified that if a child were to get hurt and the parents not take the child to seek medical care, that would be physical abuse. Is that correct?
The term of not getting medical care for a child who needs it would be medical neglect.
It's medical neglect, right? Thank you. Now, Dr. King also testified that he viewed the video of the defendant torturing and killing the baby birds. Did you recall that testimony?
I do.
And you saw those videos as well?
I did.
Okay. And you also reviewed text messages from the defendant to his friend regarding that same bird incident. Is that correct?
Correct.
So Dr. King's assessment is that the defendant wanted them to feel the pain he was feeling. And he said it was a reflection of the defendant's mental impairment. And he also referenced tension reduction. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Okay. Do you agree or disagree with Dr. King's assessment there?
I disagree. I asked the defendant very specifically about why he tortured the birds, and at no time did he tell me that it was to feel the birds feel the pain that he was feeling, or at no time did he tell me it was because of any sort of delusions or hallucinations. He told me very specifically that torturing the birds made him feel good, it made him feel pleasure, it made him feel power, and none of that sounds psychotic.
Now, his report to you regarding the torture of the birds, that's also reflected in the text messages the defendant sent to his friend, those themes of pleasure and power. Is that right?
Correct.
When I asked you about a feral child, now you heard the defendant or Dr. King's testimony that the defendant was essentially a feral child, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, if you could, doctor, please tell us what actually is a feral child.
So there's not a lot of scientific literature on the topic. I think perhaps it was being used in more of a colloquial sense, but in the scant literature that there is about it, a feral child is typically described as someone who's been raised in the wild and away from human contact. For example, a child who can't speak because they don't know the English language or any language because they are in the wild. There's also other literature that refers to feral children as people who have trouble with authority and have multiple delinquent behavior on a regular basis as an adolescent or a child.
Okay, so with the record that you reviewed, the evidence in this case, the defendant texting his friend over 20,000 times throughout a period of a year, would he fit the definition of a feral child?
Not according to the scientific literature that I'm aware of, no.
And Dr. King also testified that the defendant's form of mental illness, if not treated, typically ends with deadly consequences. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't.
Tell me why.
So, as already stated, I don't believe the defendant met statutory criteria for a mental illness at the time of the offenses. But even assuming that what was meant was something like psychosis, it's just absolutely untrue that most people with serious mental illness commit violent acts. In fact, the research shows that the vast majority of violence in our country is caused by people without mental illness. Now, Dr. King then referenced suicide, and it is true that people with mental illness are more likely to harm themselves than other people. But I don't see how that particularly applies in this case, given that the defendant specifically did not want to commit suicide so that he could see the results of his actions. So I don't agree with that statement, and I don't think it's supported by the data.
Thank you, doctor. Now, Dr. King also diagnosed the defendant with obsessive compulsive disorder and indicated that it was the defendant's obsessive thoughts and compulsion that propelled him to take the lives of innocent people. That was his testimony. Do you agree with that?
I don't.
Tell me why.
Obsessive compulsive disorder is a diagnosis that's typically characterized by intrusive and unwanted thoughts that cause marked impairment or distress in an individual. I think in this case, there is significant evidence to suggest that the recurrent violent thoughts that the defendant had from a young age were not intrusive and unwanted, but rather enjoyed and liked. He said this to me not only in his own self-report, but it's also throughout the text messages. It's also in the jail records when they ask him about these violent thoughts. So I don't believe that any sort of clinical obsessions or compulsions propelled his behavior. I also think, again, it's important to look at the jail records where he's been seen very regularly in the days, weeks, months, and years after these offenses. There's no clinician that's diagnosed him with obsessive compulsive disorder there. He hasn't shown signs of obsessive compulsive disorder as we know it clinically. And so, no, I do not believe that that drove his actions on that day.
Now, doctor, you can understand, can't you, why it's hard to believe that when someone enjoys torture and methodically plans a mass murder, how that person can actually not be insane. You can understand how that's hard to understand, right?
Absolutely.
And tell me about that.
I can absolutely understand how it would be difficult to imagine how a sane person could commit mass murder. But the research does show us that mental illness does not account for most of the violence in our country. And while it's certainly true that there may have been episodes of mass murder where the person had some broad-based mental health concerns, The research just shows us that it's rare. So it's hard to imagine, but it is rare.
Again, doctor, I brought this up to you before, but it bears repeating. Someone can display signs of crisis and be in quote unquote depression without actually meeting that definition of psychotic. Is that right?
Correct. Someone can have depression, they can have anxiety, and not meet criteria for the statutory definition of mental illness.
And is that your opinion what happened in this case?
That is my opinion in this case. In fact, it was my opinion that he was criminally responsible and that he understood the nature of what he was doing at the time of the shooting and the consequences of it.
Thank you, doctor. One moment. Judge.
Absolutely.
Doctor, you mentioned brain injury and your analysis of the defendant. Did you screen for any other issues? Something that's been brought up is fetal alcohol syndrome. Did you screen for that?
We screen for everything when we're doing this, or maybe screen is the wrong word. We consider every diagnosis when we're seeing a defendant for a forensic evaluation.
So tell me your opinion on specifically fetal alcohol syndrome.
Well, fetal alcohol syndrome is typically characterized by someone who had exposure to alcohol in the womb and is characterized by things like what we call dysmorphic facial features, meaning there's a typical facial presentation of people typically with fetal alcohol syndrome. But it's also characterized typically by things like intellectual disability, cognitive impairments, attention problems, impulsivity, things of that nature. And so, again, I don't write every diagnosis that I don't think he has in my reports, but in this particular case, if you're asking about fetal alcohol syndrome, there's no evidence that he's intellectually disabled. If anything, his IQ, even on Dr. King's testing, is average or above average, and no evidence of significant ADHD type symptoms or impulsivity. I don't believe he'd meet criteria for that disorder.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. Defense Cross.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I want to talk first about your CV. In looking at your education, I'm not seeing any specialized training or certifications in treating children or adolescents with psychiatric illness. Is that correct?
I'm not board certified in child psychiatry. In general psychiatry residency, everyone does do rotations in child psychiatry.
Okay. Your CV also lists that from 2017 to 2018, you were a staff psychiatrist at St. Joseph Mercy. Is that correct?
Correct.
During that 1 year, were you seeing patients
Yes,
in the hospital or in an office setting?
in the hospital.
Adult wing, or were you dealing with pediatrics?
Adult.
So since July of 2019 to present, you've been employed with the center as you described, correct?
Correct.
All right. And you mentioned that you see patients that are hospitalized under court order, correct?
Correct.
And as well, you perform the competency and criminal responsibility examinations.
Correct.
Would you agree with me that part of your job is to diagnose and treat mental illness?
Correct.
Are children housed at the center?
They are not.
You stated that you have performed 525 criminal responsibility exams. Is that correct?
Forensic evaluation.
Forensic evaluations. So that is a combination of both, correct?
And some other ones, we do perform or have performed other evaluations at the center in the past.
How many juveniles have you examined?
Probably less than 5.
How many juveniles charged with life offenses have you examined?
1.
Is that Mr. Crumbley?
Yes.
Is this the first time that you've testified at a Miller hearing?
Yes.
So before sitting in court and watching this hearing, were you familiar with the Miller factors?
I was. Yes.
How are the cases assigned to examiners at the center?
Mostly it is by random basis. We have a scheduling department that assigns the cases.
Were you aware that you were not the first doctor that was assigned to do the examination of Ethan Crumbley?
I was aware of that, yes.
Did you speak to the doctor that was first assigned to do the examination?
Only to ask for the flash drive that was in his possession.
Did you discuss the facts of the case with him?
No.
Do you recall when you were assigned to this case?
In February of 2022.
Can you recall when you received the list of discovery items that you have noted in your report?
Again, the previous doctor who was assigned had the flash drive full of sources of information. So as to when he specifically gave it to me, I'm not sure.
So your report is dated March 29th of 2022, correct?
Correct.
You note that you spoke with Mr. Keast on 3/1 and 3/11, correct?
Correct.
You detailed your process of when you are assigned to a case and the steps that you take. What is the reason you would talk to the prosecutor?
In a case such as this, since I spoke with the defense attorney as well, I wanted to speak to see if there was any other additional information they wanted me to have before seeing the defendant.
So I want to go over what you did review. I added up, you had it broken down by page numbers. I have that you reviewed 3,136 pages of discovery. Does that sound about right?
Yes, I'll take your word for it.
Okay. It looks like 20,688 messages between the other juvenile and Ethan.
Correct.
A Google Android extraction report, you noted there was 1,072 images,
Correct.
270 minutes of video, which is roughly 4.5 hours.
Correct.
You then met with Ethan one time,
Correct.
and that's on March 15th.
Correct.
Do you recall the start and stop time of your meeting?
It was 5 hours long.
In the items that you considered, you list evaluation unit personal history questionnaire. What is that?
When every defendant comes to the center, they're given this questionnaire. It has basic information, historical information like their name, date of birth, age. It also has things like places of employment. And then the back is for if they've ever been to any sort of psychiatric facilities. While we inquire about all of that, it's helpful to have it written down in advance to see if the defendant specifically wants to discuss anything with us.
Roughly how many questions does it have?
It's a front and back.
Okay. And do you have the patient completed in your presence, or that's something that's given to them prior to you arriving?
It's given to them prior to me arriving.
And you would agree with me what you just described is a lot of self-reported information.
Correct.
So I want to discuss what you've reviewed regarding this case since your report was authored. Obviously, it was some time ago. So it's my understanding that you reviewed Dr. Kadir's records from day one of the jail all the way up until the start of the hearing. Is that correct?
What I reviewed is day one from jail all the way up until the time that my report was authored. And then I was given additional records since that time, most recently up to July of this year.
You stated you watched the video of Ethan in jail in the restraints, correct?
Yes.
And you aren't aware if there's any other videos of situations like that in the jail. You were just presented with one, correct?
Correct.
You viewed, obviously, Dr. King's report and updated jail records, correct?
Correct.
And then you watched the testimony of Dr. King and Dr. Kadir.
Correct.
You did not speak to any family members or Ethan's parents to either confirm or disprove anything that Ethan was reporting, correct?
No, correct.
Mr. Keys touched on this a little bit, but I think it's important, so I want to touch on it again. You would agree with me there's a few ways to diagnose mental illness or to assess mental illness.
Correct.
Okay. So we talked about looking at the brain directly, and that was not done, correct?
Correct, because it typically is not.
Okay. So if someone has a suspected brain injury or brain damage, you did say that imaging could be used, correct?
If there are signs and symptoms accompanying that, then we might consider brain imaging, yes.
You can test the brain using some of the testing that Dr. King used or that you mentioned, correct?
Correct?
And you didn't perform any of that testing, correct?
No.
Or you can use the symptoms that the patient provides, correct?
Combined with, again, our clinical judgment and the diagnostic manual and data. Yes, absolutely, that's important.
Okay. What is the DSM?
It's our diagnostic manual. It lists various diagnoses and the criteria that would be required to meet those diagnoses.
And what is it used for? Is it a tool?
It's again, yes, a tool that we would use to help diagnosis.
Okay. And to diagnose mental illness, correct?
Correct.
Did you use it in relation to these facts and in this case?
Yes.
According to the DSM, the signs of major depressive disorder are depressed mood most of the day, feeling sad, empty, hopelessness, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, difficulty sleeping, agitation, fatigue, feeling worthless, thoughts of death or suicide. Do you agree with me?
I do.
You would agree with me that Ethan reported every single one of those symptoms.
He reported many of those symptoms, yes.
According to the DSM, what is the definition of psychosis?
Psychosis is a symptom of diagnoses. So there's schizophrenia in the DSM, there's schizoaffective disorder. Psychosis in and of itself is not a diagnosis, it's a symptom.
Okay, and can you describe that symptom?
Typically, like I mentioned before, it's gross impairments in recognizing reality.
What are delusions?
Delusions are fixed false beliefs that are non-reality based.
Now, I want to go over your report. I know you have it with you. On page 7, you indicate that his parents' relationship was occasionally stressful for him. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And he detailed that when he was living in Washington, and there was a situation that he recalls where he was very young and he heard his mother yelling on the phone in the middle of the night. His mother told him that his dad was missing, correct?
Correct.
And told him that his father was at a waterfall and there to commit suicide, correct?
Correct.
And it's your understanding, or at least what Ethan relayed, is that he was then put on the phone with his father and he was crying and telling him to come back home and to not kill himself.
Correct.
He also told you that his parents argued a lot.
Correct.
Moving on to page 8, you discussed preschool, and this has been discussed previously. He relays to you that he recalls in preschool where he's outside during recess and he's watching cars go by, and he says to the lunch lady, "Man, wouldn't it be cool if the cars crashed and blew up the school?" And the lunch lady was upset by that, correct?
Correct.
And he told you that's when he realized maybe other people didn't think about the things he thought about.
Correct.
So I want to go over what you have, I think is psychiatric history, page 9. He recalled his parents giving him half of a sleeping pill of his mom's prescription twice, correct?
Correct.
And he detailed that he had some sort of attack, and his parents reported to him that he was doing all this crazy stuff and saying, "I see someone," and he was walking in the driveway in shorts, correct?
Correct.
And obviously, you've reviewed the text messages. Did you review the text messages between James and Jennifer?
Some, yes.
Okay. Do you recall reviewing the text message where they actually talk about this incident?
Yes.
Okay. He told you that he recalled asking for mental health within the last year, mental
Yes.
health care. Okay. And he detailed that on his 15th birthday, he got really upset and said, "I want to see a therapist."
Mhm.
You recall that? And he explained to you that at that point, he didn't want to move forward in life.
Yes.
I wanted to stay at that point. So when I realized I'm getting older, I needed help to get past that. Is that what he reported?
Correct.
And to your knowledge, he never saw a doctor or counselor, correct?
Correct.
You then discussed suicidal thoughts. He reported that he had suicidal thoughts for a year since 9th grade and actually one suicide attempt, correct?
That he reported, yes.
And that was in October of 2021?
Correct.
And he detailed that he took 8 to 10 allergy pills. He was really sad and anxious about moving forward and getting older, correct?
Correct.
And he details that he falls asleep and he wakes up the next morning sick.
Correct.
You then talk about the voices that I know Mr. Keese asked you about, and you spend a good deal of time talking about that. So he told you that he occasionally hears external voices, variably a man or woman's voice calling his name, correct?
Correct.
He heard external voices for a week or two when in jail after the offense, but stopped when he was on constant watch.
That was his report, yes.
He then tells you once he was taken off constant watch, he began hearing them occasionally, correct?
Correct.
And there was an incident where he heard, Ethan, can you hear me? Ethan, where are you?
Correct.
There was also conversation about an internal voice, correct?
Yes.
And he described that as he felt like it was his own voice, but it was the bad side of him.
Correct. Like a conscience.
And he said the thoughts that are bad.
Correct.
And he told you that the internal voice is currently not as bad as it was before, and that he's fighting it every day.
When I saw him at that time.
Yes. Now, you stated you went through these text messages. Did you go through the web browser history?
I did. Yes.
Okay. The journal, the video he made the night before, the assignments, the emails from teachers asking that Ethan be seen by a counselor.
Yes.
Now, in your report, you picked specific messages from the other juvenile and Ethan to put in your report, correct? You obviously didn't list all of them.
Correct.
Okay. And you picked out what best suited your analysis or best suited your opinion, correct?
No, I tried to include every instance where he discussed mental illness at all.
Okay. And obviously it was to support your final conclusion, final opinion.
It was a source I used, again, as data, but I would never pick out ones just to support my own conclusion.
In your report, Ethan details that in 8th grade, he was shown his first graphic video. Do you recall?
I do.
And someone showed him a video of a guy blowing his head off.
Correct.
And he detailed to you that he couldn't stop thinking about it. And a few weeks after seeing it, he started to get interested and then looked stuff up himself, correct?
Correct.
And he told you that he was addicted to watching videos of war and people dying.
Correct.
Now, you go over the issue with the birds in your report on page 37. And I know that Mr. Keast asked you tension release, and you said you didn't agree. Well, on page 37, Ethan tells you, I felt a relief feeling, a feeling in power, correct?
Correct.
He then details after 9th grade concluded, he recalled lying in bed for 3 days straight, watching movies and TV, correct?
Correct.
And he stated that he was only getting up to go to the bathroom or to get something to eat, correct?
Correct.
You then move forward in time. So we're looking July, August of 2021. He tells you he had no social interaction with anyone other than B, his juvenile friend, correct?
Correct. Though again, when you look at the actual context,
that was generated from the defendant's phone extraction.
It was.
And if you were to go back into Celebrate today and try to create that same report, would it be in substantially the same?
With his parents, correct? Correct. His dad called him lazy. And he just, yes. And he described to you that they had had arguments in the past, but this one was really, really bad. Correct. And he stated to you that the thoughts of the shooting came back in an instant. Correct. And the good feelings he had when walking home just evaporated. Correct. So he describes the morning of the shooting. He told you he woke up feeling sick, like he had the flu. Correct. He actually went to the bathroom to puke, but nothing came out. That's what he told me, yes. He told you that he walked to school, he was quiet and sad. Correct. He told you that he was typically putting all of his bad thoughts in his notebook where no one can see it, but on that day, he drew it on a piece of paper so his teacher would look at it.
yes, exactly.
And he told you that part of him wanted to get caught, the other part didn't want to, correct?
Correct.
Then he described the moments leading up to the shooting. And he told you the thought, you asked him, I think, what was in your mind or what were you thinking about as you exited the bathroom?
Yes.
And he told you his thoughts were, don't do it, don't do it. You are not going to do it. Correct. And then he describes to you that he started firing the weapon. Correct. He told you he wasn't even looking at the people, he was looking at his hand, correct?
That's what he said, yes.
He also described the scene in the bathroom at the very end of this incident. And he tells you after shooting the person in the bathroom, at that moment, it came back to me, like what I did, correct?
That's what he said, yes.
And he told you that the second person was scared And I felt bad, like Jesus Christ. I said, I can't do this. So I escorted him out of the stall. I didn't want to hurt him, but I didn't want him to attack me. And I told that person he could go. Correct? That's what he said, yes. He then told you, my thoughts came back, like, what have I done? So I walked out of the bathroom, correct? Correct. Unloaded the gun and put it on the trash can outside of the bathroom. Correct. He saw the police and he surrendered. Yes. You spent some time going over like remorse or regret or feelings like that, and he told you, I felt like I have to say I was remorseful when it first happened, but that's what I actually feel now. Yes, that's what he said. Now, there's a large section in your report that details information that you gathered from the Oakland County Jail, and you indicated that you reviewed notes from a caseworker, and you actually dictate a number of those notes in your report. I think it's 7 pages, correct? Correct. Do you recall the name of that caseworker? No, I don't. Did you ever speak to that caseworker over the phone? No, I just reviewed her records. Do you know what that caseworker's training was? No. Do you know if he or she was a psychologist, psychiatrist, or had any sort of training in dealing with children with mental illness? Typically, if they're jail mental health staff, they have some training as a mental health professional. No, I don't heard that qualification. Okay, and you couldn't confirm it, right? You don't know. We don't typically call, we just review the records. So when you spend 7 pages of your report detailing what this person notes, you would agree with me that you relied on this reported information when forming your opinion. In part, yes. Again, many pieces of data. The jail psychiatrist records are also in there, as well as information that the defendant.
Me that you relied on this reported information when forming your opinion.
In part, yes. Again, many pieces of data. The jail psychiatrist records are also in there, as well as information that the defendant exchanged with people outside of the jail. So that
in my review of it, I think there's at least 7 pages of when you're dealing with the caseworker, and I think there's 1 sentence about Dr. Kadir. So when this caseworker reports that he's not hallucinating or he's not responding to internal stimuli, again, you don't know what type of training this person has to make those calls, correct?
are you saying that they're not a mental health professional counselor? Because again, I don't know that they'd be employed as a mental health professional at the jail.
Correct. You don't know, correct?
Again, usually in their signature, they write that they're a qualified mental health professional. It's like a QMHP, and most jails have that qualification. So I don't know if she's again, I doubt she's a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I review all of the data from the jail, including the caseworkers who regularly see people on the mental health board.
Okay. So you state in your report that you reviewed Dr. Kadir's records from 12/3 to 3/14, correct?
Correct.
And now, obviously, I understand that you've reviewed them moving forward.
Correct.
And in one line on page 57, you note the psychiatric documentation lists Mr. Crumbley's diagnosis as major depressive disorder, recurrent episode, severe. Correct? You do not spend 7 pages or any pages going over Dr. Kadir's records, correct?
Her records are absolutely included. I don't spend 7 pages because she sees him less than the caseworker who saw him daily. So again, it's all proportional. And Dr. Kadir's records, again, what I'm writing are the highlights, her diagnosis, her interactions with them, and I would note any sort of psychotic behavior that she exhibited or thought he exhibited if it was present, and it was not.
You would agree with me, though, that having another psychiatrist meeting with him daily and then weekly, her reports and her findings would be important to you, correct?
Absolutely.
Did you not include more about Dr. Kadir's reports because you don't agree with her?
No, absolutely not. I don't cut out information that I don't agree with.
Do you believe Dr. Kadir is wrong in her diagnosis?
I believe that the defendant absolutely could have developed a major depressive disorder after time in jail in isolation. But what I was opining on is whether he had a statutorily defined mental illness at the time of the shooting. So I don't necessarily disagree with Dr. Kadir, but that opinion is different than the opinion that I'm giving.
Okay. And you would agree with me, though, looking at her records from the very start, just days after he was incarcerated, she's already diagnosing him with this major depressive disorder, correct?
Correct. And I would also just note, though, that Dr. Padier, as a jail psychiatrist, is not forensically trained. So our training may have been different, and thus our conclusions may also be different.
You have come to know that he is currently on multiple prescription medications to treat mental illness and anxiety, correct?
Correct.
So is your testimony that you are in a better position to diagnose him after your one-time visit with him in March than the doctor who sees him every week?
No, because again, those medications that he's on have been added over the months that he's been in jail and years. So whether he has, again, depression, major depression, an adjustment disorder, I believe she diagnosed him with, whether he has that now after a year of being in a jail cell by himself with the enormity of his charges, that's different than, again, if he met statutory definition at the time he shot the school.
But you would agree with me, her diagnosis came very early in the first few days she visited with him, correct?
One of her diagnoses did, but
Yes.
she didn't place him on medications for months.
Well, I believe there is dictation in her report stating that it was discussed and it was Mr. Crumbley who was saying he didn't want medication, correct?
In part, but a lot of the medications he's on now were never discussed at the beginning.
Are you familiar with the PHQ-9 score?
I am, yes.
And in reviewing Dr. Kadir's records, do you agree that it appears that he has made progress in relation to that PHQ-9 score?
Yes, that's a self-report. It's a checklist. And yes, over time, that number has gone down in her records.
Okay. So you would agree with me that one of the first tests in February of 2022, he scored in the moderately severe active treatment psychiatrist and therapy, and then was then scored months later as mild, correct?
Correct.
I want to discuss the definition that you have in your report of mental illness. In your report, it states a substantial disorder of thought or mood which significantly impairs judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or ability to cope with ordinary demands of life, correct?
Correct.
And in your opinion, you found that Ethan did not have mental illness as defined by statute.
Correct. At the time of the offenses.
Correct. You then state, I recognize my opinion on this matter requires significant clarification. Why did you write that?
Because I could see that the perception of someone who's writing that they have hallucinations and writing that they have low mood and suicidal thoughts, when you read just those things, it comes to mind this person's mentally ill. So that's why I felt it required significant clarification to explain why that may not meet the criteria and why some of the things that he was reporting do not meet actual clinical diagnoses.
Okay. You state, I acknowledge that there is data that taken on the surface could initially suggest that Ethan experienced symptoms associated with a psychotic disturbance around the time of the offenses. You go on to talk about the text where he's talking about ghosts or demons, external voices and shadows, hallucinations, the video the night before where he talks about those three voices, talks about a demon. But you state that, and I think you mentioned this earlier, you rationalize it with, well, the belief in a haunted house is not in itself a mental illness. So it's not uncommon when someone is watching scary movies. So you're telling me each and every time that he has these incidents where he's either texting his mother or he's texting B, his juvenile friend, about things flying off the shelf, or doors closing, things falling, hearing footsteps, a toilet flushing. Your explanation of that is he must have been watching scary movies during every single one of those events, and that's why he's reporting that.
So he's not watching them every single time, counselor, but he is watching them much of the time. And the other times, you need to look at the context of how he is acting outside of these self-reports. There's no report from, again, or there's no kind of clinical data in terms of hallucinating in Spanish class and having someone else see that hallucination, or being at work and having your friend also hallucinate it. So no, he's not watching horror movies every time, but when you look at all these different instances, there's just, it doesn't line up with true psychosis for all the reasons that I mentioned.
The things that he does describe, like we just talked about, could be delusions or hallucinations. They could be.
They could be. I don't feel that the evidence supports that.
Now, the conversation or the mention that you made in your report about the voices. In the video, he says the voices are me. I am the voices. So these voices are his conscience rather than a psychotic illness. Is that what your opinion is?
In part, again, I asked him very specifically about those statements in the video, and he at no point told me that he was hallucinating when he made that video. He wasn't hallucinating on the day of the offense, and he wasn't hallucinating for days prior. So even if you take his hallucinations at face value, which again I disagree with, but even if you do, he specifically told me he wasn't psychotic or hallucinating in and around the time of the offenses.
Did you tell him what the definitions of those big words are? I mean, he's 15 years old, obviously doesn't have medical training. So
No, that's exactly right.
Mhm.
That's why I don't think that he was lying. I think that he was misusing a clinical term. And that's why we as medical professionals have to tease that out.
So the voice that he talks about, not only in his journal, but also in that video, you're saying it's his conscience, correct?
Are you talking about what he calls the internal voice?
The internal voice, yes.
Yes, I do believe it's most consistent with something like a conscience. He identified it as the bad thoughts that he had had since he was a young child. And so, again, he very specifically told me it's my voice, it's not an external voice, it's what I think about.
Okay. So is it normal that a 15-year-old boy has a voice in their head telling him to kill?
No, it's not normal.
Okay.
But the question is it psychotic? And the answer is no.
So I understand that everyone has a conscience. I mean, for example, you're approaching a yellow light. You have a quick dialogue in your head. I really need to get home. I'm late, but I don't want a ticket. So are you telling this court that it's normal in a scenario for someone's conscience or internal voice to say, run the red light, hit as many cars as possible, swerve toward the kids in the walkway, don't stop for police? Is that normal?
I don't think anyone would say that the violent thoughts or desires to kill and torture that the defendant was having were normal. But we have to differentiate what is not normal from what is a clinical, statutorily defined mental illness. So in no way am I saying that those thoughts are normal or good, but they are also not psychotic.
Hearing a voice in your head telling you to do bad things could be delusions, could be psychosis.
It wouldn't be a delusion because that's not the definition of that. And again, a voice could be psychotic, but in this case, it was his own voice saying what the things that he liked to do in terms of the violent thoughts. And I don't believe it was psychotic.
So you say that there is no indication from objective sources that Ethan engaged in unusual behavior that would be typical of psychosis, correct?
Correct.
So again, psychosis is a disconnection from reality. Symptoms are delusions, hallucinations, talking incoherently, and agitation. It can cause one to harm themselves or become violent towards others. Would you agree with me?
I would, though some of those terms are very general, like agitation, that could be psychotic. It also could just be agitation. So there, again, it kind of depends, but generally, yes. I would
Okay.
agree.
And after everything we just discussed, you don't think that's what we're looking at here?
I do not, no.
So the jail staff, you indicated that they never reported that he was responding to internal stimuli, and Mr. Keys had you define that. You would agree with me that not everyone who is responding to internal stimuli has visible symptoms, correct?
Responding to internal stimuli by definition is visible. So again, like if someone is actively hallucinating, what we typically see are visible signs of that. Again, the distraction, the difficulty in attending to a conversation, the speech disorganization. It would be quite atypical for someone with psychosis as severe as what is being postulated to display no visible signs.
Is there always signs and symptoms of mental illness at all? I mean, can someone have mental illness and you look at them and you would have no idea? You would agree with me there?
Absolutely, but that's different than what we're talking about here.
I agree. It's different than psychosis.
But yes, absolutely. You can't just look at someone and necessarily tell that they have depression or anxiety.
Okay. You stated that you believe the motivation for his shooting did not appear to be based on a delusional or psychotic process. And you have in your report that Ethan felt like the thoughts to shoot the school was as if I saw a prophecy of my future and I had to fulfill it. I want to go over that again because you're saying it's not based on delusion, it's not based on psychotic process, but then he believes he has to fulfill a prophecy.
Again, I think the wording is very important, counselor. So he's saying it's as if I was having a prophecy. That's a turn of phrase. He at no point during the interview told me I had to shoot the school to fulfill a prophecy. He told me that he had been thinking about this for months and months, not because of a prophecy, but because he had been thinking about it. So when I asked him specifically, why did this happen? Were you hearing voices? Did you have any beliefs about it? He didn't keep referring back to this idea of a prophecy. In my analysis, that's very much a turn of phrase and not a delusion.
So obviously when you begin your interviews, you explain to the patient why you're there and the purpose of the interview, correct?
Correct.
So Ethan obviously understood what it was for.
Correct.
And obviously if he wanted to make himself out to be mentally ill at a higher degree as a way to minimize his actions, obviously he could have reported some very, very heightened symptoms, correct?
Correct.
Could have told you aliens and ghosts made him do it. He could start talking to voices while you're present with him, correct?
Correct.
And he didn't do that.
No, I didn't believe he was feigning or malingering at all.
And you have had interviews, I'm sure, where you believe that a patient is over-reporting or is saying things that you don't believe are true, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And really what he told you in that interview did match up with the text messages to be, correct?
Correct.
The text messages between James and Jennifer, the one about the specific incident, correct?
Correct.
The fact, what he was Googling, what he was looking up, the videos he was watching, what he was writing in his journal, correct?
Yes, I felt he was very forthcoming.
Okay. And you agree with me that when you look at Dr. Kadir's records, he's reporting the same things there as well?
In terms of all of those things, I
Correct.
don't think he's discussed all of them, but yes.
So you would agree with me what Ethan has reported has been pretty consistent?
Yes.
So you mentioned the testing, and you stated that that testing only shows the symptoms on that day, or more closer in time to the exam rather than to the incident, correct?
Yes, what I said is that you can't necessarily extrapolate any results from a psychological test you do later and say it definitively proves they were thinking that 6 months prior or a year prior.
Okay. And I understand that, but again, you would agree with me, he's reporting the same things.
Yes, though what I would say is that I think absolutely his symptoms worsened once he was in jail and in isolation in a jail cell. So yes, he reports the same things in terms of depression, but the experience in life that he's in now is very different than what he was in November. So I don't think that you can correlate the two necessarily.
So again, I want to talk about the possibility of over-reporting, the possibility of having a patient come before you and tell you things that you don't necessarily believe, okay? And you stated you have had patients like that, correct?
I have. I didn't feel like this defendant was.
Okay. You actually testified in the case of People versus Hallam in December of 2022, where you discussed this same issue, correct? About
Correct.
over-reporting?
Correct.
And in that case, you were performing a criminal responsibility exam, correct?
Correct.
And in that case, after your initial evaluation, you had concerns that the defendant was not being truthful.
Correct. Because in that case, it's very different. What he was telling me during the evaluation made me suspicious for malingering.
Okay.
So that's why I got a psychological test
Mhm.
to see if he was malingering in that moment that he was speaking to me.
Okay. And you testified that one of the signs that you look for when you're concerned with a patient feigning or intentionally producing symptoms of mental illness is them thrusting their illness forward in your face. Like, I want to tell you about this, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Ethan didn't do that, correct? He waited to be prompted and answered your questions.
Correct. As already stated, I had no suspicion that he was malingering during the evaluation.
Also in that trial, you testified self-reporting may not be reliable when different things are told to different people. We don't have that here either, correct? He's reporting the same thing.
Correct. He's been consistent.
You testified if someone had true mental illness that was a psychotic illness, one would expect that the person had symptoms prior to the crime or prior to the incident, correct?
Correct?
And your testimony is that Ethan had no symptoms that were of psychotic nature leading up to November 30th. Is that correct?
That's correct. Again, counselor, he reported psychotic symptoms, but we have to do more than take self-report at face value. And when we use our clinical expertise and judgment to examine what he reported prior to the offense, because I acknowledge he reported it prior to the offense, it just simply doesn't match up with true clinical psychosis.
And in that case, People versus Hallam, after your initial interview, you had him seen by a psychologist for testing, correct?
Correct. Again, because there was suspicion of malingering at the time that I saw him.
And you testified that a psychologist doing testing can be one piece of helpful data as you come to your opinion. You agree?
Absolutely. Again, one piece of data.
And in that case, you had Dr. Shields, I believe that is a doctor also at the center, correct?
Yes, she's a psychologist there.
You had her perform the MMPI-3, correct?
Correct.
You do not have training in performing these tests or reading the results, correct?
The way that we do it at the center is that psychologists are the ones performing and interpreting the testing. We as psychiatrists certainly refer for testing and consult with the psychologist on what question we have and what tests we think are legitimate to answer the question. So it's not that we have no training on it. We're certainly familiar with the test and the results, but at the center, the psychologists conduct the tests.
Okay. And are you familiar with that MMPI-3 test?
I am.
Okay. So not only is it a 330 question test of self-reporting signs and symptoms of mental illness, there's a validity scale built in.
Yes, it's one of the ones of Dr. King's testing, the majority of which did not have them. That is one of the ones that did.
So it shows the score as it relates to the self-reported information, but then also gives you a score or indication as to whether the symptoms that are being reported are feigning or untrue, correct?
Correct.
Do you agree that any score above 60 causes some concern or notes that there's some psychiatric things going on there?
Correct.
Okay.
Again, it depends on what scale, but yes.
Sure. Did you go over the results of that test?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to draw your attention to page 35 of Dr. King's report.
Okay.
Actually, let's go to 34 first.
Okay.
Which version are we referring to?
The one that was admitted by myself.
Would that be
That-
63?
Your Honor, it would be in my defendant's exhibit binder, which is exhibit N as in Nancy.
Okay.
So let's look at 34. There is it looks like a validity scale. Is that correct?
Yes.
And following, there is some statements. It says, a review of the validity scale indicates Ethan's T-score is 48, which is an indication that his responses were in the normal range for inconsistency reporting, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So again, we're looking at anything above 60. So let's go through the results here. So still on that page on 34, it says Ethan's score 75 is elevated. Let me see. Infrequent responses. Let's go to page 35. So let's go through the actual scores. So a review of higher order and restructured clinical scales indicates elevations of EID, which is emotional internalizing dysfunction. We have a score of 75, correct?
Yes, but I would just note now the scales you're talking about are a little different, but
Okay. We have under thought disorder, score of 85.
correct.
Demoralization, score of 79.
Yes.
Ideas of persecution, indicated when someone feels he is devalued, trapped, constantly persecuted with no means of escape. We have an 80, correct?
Correct.
I'm sorry, Ms. Lawson, before you move on, because you started with page 34. I can't-
35, I apologize. What I just read was on the bottom of page 35.
Thank you.
Let's move to page 36, the bottom. Helplessness and hopelessness, score is 70.
Yes.
Obsessive compulsive, score is 80.
Yes.
Following page 37 at the bottom. Negative school attitude, score is 65.
Yes.
Family problems, score is 80.
Yes.
Page 38 at the bottom. I don't know how to pronounce the word that is in quotations. Can you help me?
Are you talking about
In
psychosis?
parentheses. Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to butcher that. So, which is indicative of someone who has pervasive and intrusive thoughts. His score is 80, correct?
Correct.
You would agree with me that this test can give you some good information, correct?
Absolutely. It's one piece of data to consider.
Again, you did not have this test done with Ethan, yes or no?
No, because again, it shows what he was experiencing and reporting at the time the test was given.
You did not have any psychologist come and do any type of testing with Ethan, correct?
No, I did not.
All right, let's go back to your report. You state on page 62, it is my opinion that there was no indication that these reported symptoms of depression were severe enough to significantly impair his judgment, behavior, capacity to recognize reality, or his ability to cope with the ordinary demands of life at the time of the alleged incident. Correct?
Correct.
I want to talk about the ordinary demands of life. There is a lot of text messages, writings in his journal, in the video about school, specifically about college, the progression of life from being a kid. In review of everything, that is a huge issue for Ethan, correct? He can't get over the fact that he's going to get older, things are going to change, that he doesn't have a plan, that he's going to either be dead or homeless, correct?
He reported that, yes.
Okay. Obviously, growing up is a demand of life.
I suppose so.
And it's still your opinion that you feel he was able to cope with those ordinary demands of life, even though he mentions that he is so struggling with them in multiple avenues.
Yes, because again, when you look at his functional status in his life, he's reporting these things. But when you look at what he's actually doing on a day-to-day basis, I don't believe he met that functional impairment criteria.
But you're aware he quit the bowling team, he stopped working, and once his friend was there, he essentially would go to school and come home, and that's it.
Well, again, even in the month after his friend cut off contact, even in that month, he was doing things that brought him pleasure and that he engaged in terms of other hobbies and activities. He was future oriented, which is another thing that we look for when we look at major depression. So he was hopeful that a girl in school that he liked him back. And you even mentioned how the day before the offenses, that almost caused him, in his own report, to not go through with the shooting. So he was future oriented. He was doing things that he thought were fun. When you look at his daily activities, no, I don't think that he met that criteria.
When you say future oriented, he talks about going to prison. Is that what you consider future oriented? He's looking forward to that?
So he was very aware of the consequences of his behavior.
Okay. Let's talk about the lack of sleep. You stated, obviously, in looking at those text messages, you can see that he is texting very late into the night, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And your opinion on that is, well, basically it's chronic. It's not something that just occurred around the crime. So really that doesn't play into your opinion.
No, it did play into my opinion. What I was looking at specifically is whether he exhibited signs of mania, which often, would fit criteria for that major mood disorder. And when we look at his sleep patterns, not only were they chronic, but he had what's called very poor sleep hygiene. So he was drinking liters of Mountain Dew every night, or frequently at night. He was staying up very late and then sleeping during the day. There's text messages with his friends, even in the months prior, that he said that he's basically nocturnal. So not necessarily that he was getting no sleep, it's that his sleep schedule was altered. And when you look at something like mania, that's a decreased need for sleep where someone's not feeling tired. And that's not what we saw here. This wasn't a decreased need for sleep. It was a poor sleep hygiene with sleep at different times of the day and not consistent with mania.
Obviously, in looking at his attendance record, he was attending school extremely regularly. So if he's up till 1, 2, or 3 in the morning, obviously he's then at school at 7:30 or 7:45, correct?
What he told me is that in the summer, he was nocturnal, so he was sleeping during the day. And then as school started in the fall of 2021, he would go to bed late and wake up about 4 to 5 hours later, getting that less amount of sleep, but he would feel very tired. That's a differentiating factor from something like mania, where the person feels like they don't need to sleep. They feel like they have tons of energy despite getting inadequate amounts. So this was not that. He was quite tired and feeling the effects of that.
Okay. You would agree with me that obviously the brain needs rest and the brain needs food to function properly.
Sure.
I want to talk about your comment about the violent thoughts. You stated that violent thoughts have been present since preschool. I'm talking about page 67. And he had previously dealt with them in other ways instead of carrying out a mass shooting. So you list that he dealt with those violent thoughts by playing video games, by killing animals, and going to a shooting range or watching movies, correct?
Correct.
I need help understanding this because you say he does not fit the definition of having mental illness. And then you say he's been able to control these violent voices by killing animals. So he should have been able to stay home that day and torture a bird instead of doing what he did.
So again, counselor, I understand it's very hard to imagine how someone who's sane can torture animals and who can commit mass murder. But the fact remains that they are, and they do. It's not everyone who tortures an animal does it because of psychosis or because of mental illness. It may seem completely horrible or illogical to people who are not in that situation, but it doesn't automatically equate to mental illness. So the point I was making in this paragraph, where I was talking about his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the time of the offense, what we mean by that is, did he have alternative courses of action that he could have chosen instead of shooting the people at the school? And he demonstrated he had multiple alternatives. We might not agree with them, but he was able to deal with those urges in other ways rather than killing people. And that included killing animals. It's not great, but he was able to do things other than killing people, and he chose not to.
You stated in your report that Mr. Crumbley's comportment with police and jail staff following the shooting suggests that he is able to engage in appropriate behavior surrounding this period of time, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And again, I know we talked about this before. Mental illness presents itself in many ways, correct?
Yes and no, counselor. If someone's acutely psychotic, that presents in a typical way.
Mhm.
So yes, everyone is different, and anxiety might present differently than depression, but there are set things that we expect clinically if someone is acutely psychotic, and he did not display any of those.
Okay. So I asked more specifically just about mental illness.
Sure.
So
then
psychosis
yes.
isn't the only type of mental illness. You would agree with me?
Correct.
Okay. Not everybody with debilitating mental illness is walking down the street and talking to voices. You would agree with me?
Correct.
Okay. And I believe you touched on this before. A psychotic episode doesn't last perpetually, correct? It's not forever.
Correct.
Okay. So someone may be having a psychotic episode and then return to reality.
Not in the way that this was displayed, no. Because again, without intervention, without some sort of antipsychotic treatment or psychiatric intervention, it would be very atypical for someone to be acutely psychotic and hallucinating and show no signs of that afterwards or in the days, weeks, and months following the offense.
You testified earlier that there was no bizarre behavior. Is your testimony that shooting fellow students is not bizarre behavior?
Not in a way that indicates mental illness, no. Again, we're not saying that it's good behavior or that it's normal behavior, but not all murder, not all violence is attributable to mental illness.
I want to finish with talking about the form of your report. You would agree with me that when you're doing a particular examination like the one you did here for criminal responsibility, there's a form or a rubric that is used.
I don't know if it's a rubric, but yes, we have reports with standard language, for example, the statutory language that is similar from one report to the other.
Okay. And would it be fair to assume that when you started with the center, you read other people's reports or you became familiar with how other doctors were doing their reports?
Yes.
Okay. I want to go over another report that you completed. I apologize for the microphone. Because of the sensitive nature, obviously, of the defendant's name, I'm just going to call him MC. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes,
I don't intend to admit this.
thank you.
Thank you.
When you have a moment, can you review that report and see if that is one that you authored?
Yes, I did.
So I'd like to compare the reports that you did for Ethan and this other defendant that we're calling MC.
Okay.
So if you could go to the first page of the report, and Your Honor, I will always give you the report pages for Ethan, since that's the report that you have in front of you.
Thank you.
So page 1, the bottom of the first paragraph, you would agree with me that in both reports you write, this report summarizes findings from his or her evaluation and my reasoning with respect to my opinion regarding his mental state at the time of the offenses referenced above. You would agree with me it's the same in both reports?
Correct, because the purpose of the evaluation is the same.
All right, let's go to page 57 of Ethan's report. And we're looking at page 19 in the report of MC. Obviously, you stated you quote the exact same applicable statute, correct?
Correct, the statute is the same for criminal responsibility evaluations.
Page 58, section under conclusions and opinions relative to criminal responsibility. That is page 19 in the other report.
Correct.
You would agree with me, the paragraph begins to reiterate, according to Michigan law, a person is deemed, and it goes on. You would agree with me that that section is completely the same?
Judge, I'm just going to object as irrelevance. I believe what counsel's trying to do is show that this doctor's own work product, her own work product, is similar to her work product in this case. When Dr. King testified, he was cross-examined about taking the conclusions of Dr. Carol Holden and adopting them as his own, and then testified it was the rubric, and that's why that happened. This line of questioning has no relevance to that topic because this is Dr. Anker's own work product. So I object.
Thank you. Your response to relevance.
Your Honor, in response, obviously they were attacking Dr. King because the report was similar to someone else's report. The point of what I am going through here, and I can speed it up to the opinion that she has, it is the exact same wording, and that was attacked very, very harshly when it came to Dr. King. So whether he was using a rubric from a different doctor or using a report from a different case, it is a different case and a different set of facts. So if the summary opinion that she has signed here is the exact same in this other case that she has reviewed, I believe that it's relevant.
Thank you. If you could please get to the point, I'm going to sustain the objection, but you may ask the question about the conclusion.
Of course. Let's move to the opinion then.
Yes, let's.
Let's go to opinion regarding mental illness.
Yes.
That is page 59 on Ethan's report, page 20 of MC. You would agree with me that both reports state regarding the question of whether you substitute a new patient's name in, had a mental illness as defined by statute at the time of the alleged incident for which he is charged. It is my opinion that he did not, correct?
Correct, because I also thought that patient did not have a mental illness. That's just stating my opinion.
Sure, and it's the exact same sentence structure, the exact same sentence, correct?
All it's stating is regarding.
I'm asking yes or no. Is it the
Yes.
same?
Yes.
Let's move then to opinion regarding relevant capacities.
Okay.
That is page 64 on Ethan's report, page 24 on the other report. You would agree with me that it is the exact same except the name is switched.
It's a restatement of the statutory guidelines.
I'm asking yes or no. Is it the same except you switch out the name?
Yes, because the statutory guidelines are the same.
Let's move to the very last page of your report
Okay.
and of Ethan's report. Summary opinion. Would you agree with me? It is word for word the same, except you switch out the person's name.
Because it is relisting the statutory.
I'm asking
definition
yes or
of
no,
mental
ma'am.
illness. Yes, counselor.
And that is your summary opinion. It is the exact same in both cases. You're switching out the name.
because you can't change the statute. The definition is the same, no matter how you write it. So what I am restating in my summary opinion in both cases is that I did not believe the person met the statutory definition. So yes, it is the same.
I have nothing further. Thank you very
Before
much.
Sit down, I had a question.
Absolutely.
Going back to Dr. King's report, you had started at page 34. Under the validity scale, allow the doctor an opportunity to get there. Specifically, page 34 of Dr. King's report.
Okay,
Please let me know when you've gotten there.
yes.
It says a review of the validity scale, VRIN-R, indicates Ethan T-score is 48, which is an indication that his responses